the frost carved maps onto the window glass, delicate white rivers spreading from the corners. Catherine pressed her palm to the pane, and her twin sister Eliza placed hers beside it, their hands identical down to the small scar each bore on the left thumb from the day they had learned to split kindling. Outside, the January wind sang sharp across the flat reach of the Thornfield Territory, a place so cold that spit froze before it struck the ground. They were 17, and they had been alone since the fever took their parents 3 months prior. The cabin they had grown up in still stood a mile east, but it belonged to the bank now, sold to cover debts they had not known existed. The town constable, a man named Harwick with kind eyes and an apologetic voice, had given them until spring to find lodging. It was a generosity that felt like a sentence. The boarding house charged $2 a week per person, money they did not have. The church ladies' aid had offered to take them in separately, to different households where they might earn their keep as hired girls. Catherine and Eliza had thanked them and declined. They would not be separated. They sat now in the drafty back room of the general store, where Mr. Brennan let them sleep in exchange for sweeping and stacking. The room smelled of burlap and lamp oil. Their possessions fit into a single trunk. Catherine had been sewing piecework for Mrs. Talbot, shirts at 5 cents each, and Eliza had been washing laundry for the hotel, but the combined income barely covered their meals. The cold was a physical weight. It pressed against the walls, seeped through the floorboards, settled into their bones. They wore every layer they owned to sleep. Then Mr. Brennan knocked on their door one morning in late January and told them an old trapper named Josiah Fletcher had frozen to death 2 nights prior on the road from his claim. The claim itself, a remote parcel out on the plains near Coldwater Ridge, was being posted for back taxes, $40. If no one claimed it within the week, it would revert to the territory. Mr. Brennan had looked at them with an expression they could not quite read. Concern, perhaps, or the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to influence a decision that might lead to disaster. The man had a structure out there, he said, some kind of barrel-roofed shed he had built from salvaged materials, probably from an old railroad project or mining camp. It was crude, but it had 4 walls and a door. That was more than they had. Fletcher had lived there for 3 seasons, trapping beaver and muskrat from the creek beds, selling pelts in town twice a year. He had been a solitary man, not unfriendly, but not given to conversation. He had frozen on the road coming back from town with supplies, caught in a sudden storm without shelter. They had found him 2 days later, already covered in snow. Catherine and Eliza looked at each other. They did not need words. $40 was everything they had managed to save, every cent from the sewing and the washing, coins wrapped in a handkerchief and hidden at the bottom of the trunk. It was also their only chance. The boarding house would take them through February, perhaps into March if they stretched their earnings. But then what? Separate households, separate lives, the slow dissolution of the only family they had left. Or this, a gamble on a dead man's shelter 5 miles from town in the coldest winter anyone could remember. They walked to the land office that afternoon through snow that came up past their ankles. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, pulled the plat map and showed them the parcel. It was 2 miles from the nearest ranch, 5 from the town proper, no road access, no well on record. The structure was not even listed as a dwelling, just noted as an improvement, estimated value $12. The land itself was considered marginal, too far from water sources for farming, too exposed for comfortable habitation. He asked if they were certain, his tone suggesting he thought them foolish. Catherine signed the deed transfer with her father's surname, her hand steady despite the cold. They paid the $40. The walk to the claim took them most of a day. They left before dawn with the trunk lashed to a small sled they had borrowed, dragging it across the frozen ground. The cold was enormous. It made their teeth ache and their lungs burn. Eliza's breath frosted the wool scarf wrapped around her face, and Catherine's fingers went numb inside her gloves. They walked in silence, saving their energy, stopping only to rest when their legs shook with fatigue. The land was flat and white and endless. Sparse brown grass poked through the snow in tufted patches, and the wind moved across it like something alive. They followed the landmarks the clerk had described. A lightning-struck cottonwood, a line of old fence posts, a dry creek bed. When they finally saw the structure, Catherine felt her heart drop. It sat alone in the middle of the white plain, a strange curved shape like a bread loaf made of wood and metal. The roof arched up and over in a single corrugated sweep, rusted and patched. The walls were vertical only at the base, curving inward as they rose to meet the roof. 2 small windows flanked a simple wooden door, their panes so dirty they looked black. A narrow path had been worn through the snow to the entrance, though the wind was already filling it in. It looked abandoned. It looked impossible. Eliza set down the sled rope and flexed her hands. Catherine walked forward. The door was barred from the outside with a plank of wood laid across 2 iron brackets. She lifted it free. The hinges screamed as she pulled the door open, a sound that scattered a pair of crows from a distant tree. The interior was dark and bitterly cold. A single shaft of pale light fell through a crack in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust. The space was larger than it had appeared from outside. One long room perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 wide, the curved ceiling high enough to stand beneath at the center. The floor was packed earth, uneven and frozen hard. Along the back wall stood a small iron stove, its pipe extending crookedly through a hole in the roof. A wooden bunk frame without a mattress sat against one wall. A table made from rough planks. 3 wooden crates. That was all. Catherine walked to the stove and opened the firebox. Inside were the cold remains of the trapper's last fire, white ash and a few charred sticks. She touched the metal. It was like touching stone pulled from a river in winter. Eliza came in behind her, pulling the trunk. She closed the door against the wind. The silence that followed was absolute. They stood together in that narrow shaft of light, 2 girls in wool coats and long skirts, their breath visible in the air between them. Catherine looked at her sister. Eliza's face was pale with cold, but her jaw was set. They had done harder things. They had buried their parents. They had kept each other alive this long. This was just the next thing. Catherine spoke first. "We will need wood." Eliza nodded. "And we will need to know if that stove draws properly." They set to work. The landscape offered little. No trees grew within sight, only the sparse winter grass and the occasional thorny shrub. But a quarter-mile to the east, they found what the trapper had found, a dry gulch where cottonwood and willow had once grown thick before some long-ago flood had killed them. The dead trees stood gray and skeletal, their wood seasoned hard by years of sun and wind. Catherine and Eliza worked in tandem, the way they had always worked. Eliza held the branches steady, while Catherine sawed through them with the old bow saw they had found in one of the crates. They spoke little, conserving warmth, but their movements were synchronized. When Catherine's arms tired, Eliza took the saw without being asked. When Eliza stumbled in the snow, Catherine steadied her. They dragged the wood back on the sled, load after load, until they had a pile outside the door that reached to Catherine's waist. Inside, Eliza cleared the ash from the firebox while Catherine examined the stovepipe. It was dented and the joints were loose, but it was intact. She found a roll of wire in one of the crates and bound the joints tight. Eliza crumpled pages from an old almanac they found and built a small nest of kindling. Catherine struck the flint. The spark caught, the paper flared, and the kindling began to crackle. They fed it carefully, adding larger pieces as the fire took hold. Smoke began to rise. For a terrible moment, it seemed the pipe would not draw and they would choke, but then the draft caught and pulled the smoke upward and out. The fire strengthened. Heat began to radiate from the iron. It was a small heat, a fragile heat, but it was real. That first night they slept in their coats on the wooden bunk, pressed together for warmth with the trunk at their feet. The fire in the stove burned low but steady. Outside the wind howled, and the metal roof creaked and groaned like a living thing. Catherine lay awake listening to it, feeling the cold press against her back through the wall. Beside her, Eliza's breathing was steady. They had survived the first day. In the morning, Catherine woke to find frost coating the inside of the windows in delicate fern patterns. Her breath hung in the air. The fire had burned down to embers. She slid from the bunk carefully, trying not to wake Eliza, and fed the stove until flames licked up again. The light revealed details she had not seen in yesterday's gloom. The curved walls were made of wooden ribs like a ship's hull, covered over with sheets of corrugated metal. Some of the sheets were rusted through in places, and cold air whistled in through the gaps. The floor was just packed earth, frozen now, but come spring, it would turn to mud. The roof leaked where the stovepipe penetrated it, and there were other cracks where the metal had pulled away from the wooden frame. This structure was not meant for winter. It was a summer shelter, a way station. The trapper had died trying to outlast the cold in it. But Catherine saw something else too. She saw that the wooden ribs were sound, cut from good timber and joined with care. She saw that the foundation, such as it was, sat on ground that drained well. She saw that the orientation faced south, catching what little sun the winter offered. Someone had built this with thought. It could be improved. Eliza woke and joined her. They ate a cold breakfast of bread and the last of the cheese Mrs. Brennan had given them. Then Catherine spoke. "We cannot live through the winter like this. The walls leak too badly." Eliza looked at the gaps in the metal, at the frost patterns on the inside of the walls. "We have no money for materials." Catherine walked the perimeter of the room, running her hand along the ribs. "But we have these. Good bones. If we could seal the gaps, insulate the walls." Eliza followed her thinking. "The earth. We could pack the walls with earth." Catherine turned to her. "Like a soddy." Eliza nodded slowly. "The homesteaders built entire houses from sod. It holds heat better than wood. We would need to cut it in blocks, layer it against the outside of the walls." Catherine looked at the door, at the frozen plain beyond. "The ground is too hard now." Eliza considered. "We could start inside, build up the floor. If we bring earth in and let it thaw by the fire, we could pack it smooth and let it freeze again. A proper floor would stop the cold rising from below." They began that morning. Using a broken shovel they found behind the structure, they chipped at the frozen ground outside, prying up chunks of earth and carrying them inside in the wooden crates. The work was methodical and exhausting. Each strike of the shovel against the frozen ground sent jarring vibrations up through their arms. The earth came up in irregular chunks, some the size of a fist, others larger, all of them hard as fired clay. By the fire's heat, the frozen soil softened. They spread it across the floor in layers, packing it down with their feet, with flat stones, with the shovel blade. It was brutal work. Their hands blistered, and their backs ached. Catherine's palms split open where she gripped the shovel handle, and Eliza wrapped them with strips torn from an old shirt. They took turns at the heavy work, one digging while the other hauled and spread, switching when muscles began to shake with fatigue. The stove had to be kept burning hot to thaw the frozen earth, which meant constant attention to the fire, constant feeding of wood. But slowly, over days, the floor rose and leveled. They worked in layers, allowing each one to freeze solid before adding the next, building up a surface that was smooth and even. When the final layer was in place, they took the shovel blade and scraped it smooth, then sprinkled it with water from melted snow and let it freeze one last time. When it froze again in the night, it froze smooth and hard as stone, and the cold that had seeped up from below was sealed away. The difference was immediate. Standing on the new floor felt like standing on bedrock instead of ice. When the floor was done, they turned to the walls. The weather had warmed slightly, enough that the top few inches of soil outside had softened. Using the shovel and a knife, they began to cut sod, slicing it into rough bricks a hand's width, thick. The technique was simple, but required precision. Catherine would cut 3 sides of a rectangle. Then Eliza would work the shovel blade underneath to lift it free. The grass roots held the soil together in tough, fibrous mats, creating a natural binding stronger than mud alone. Each brick weighed perhaps 20 pounds and had to be carried carefully to keep it from breaking apart. They stacked the bricks against the outside of the structure, working from the ground up, layering them like stones in a wall. The first course went down directly on the frozen ground, fitted tight against the base of the wooden ribs. The second course overlapped the joints of the first, the way a mason would lay brick. Catherine worked on one side while Eliza worked on the other, and they met in the middle of each wall, fitting the last brick together. Between courses, they packed loose soil into any gaps, creating a seal against the wind. The work was slow and demanded patience. Each brick had to be cut, carried, and placed with care. A brick placed carelessly would crack or crumble, wasting effort and material. Their dresses grew heavy with mud. Their hands were raw and bleeding, the cuts from the shovel work reopening with each day's labor. But the walls began to disappear beneath the earthen layer, and the wind's howl grew muffled. They could feel the difference even as they worked outside. The air near the structure grew calmer, protected by the rising sod walls. The temperature inside the structure rose degree by degree, each course of sod adding insulation, trapping heat that had previously bled away into the winter air. They worked through February, 2 figures alone on the white plain, bending and lifting and building. Occasionally, they would see a rider in the distance, and the rider would stop and watch them before moving on. No one came to help. In town, when they went for supplies, spending the last of their meager savings on flour and salt, people looked at them with pity and disapproval. 2 girls trying to winter in that old wreck. They would not last. Mrs. Talbot told Catherine she still had sewing work available if she came to her senses. The hotel keeper told Eliza there was a room in the attic she could have. No mention of Catherine. They thanked them both and walked back out onto the plains. By early March, the structure was transformed. The sod walls rose 5 feet up the sides, thick and solid. Catherine and Eliza had left gaps for the windows and door, and they had sealed the top, where the sod met the metal roof, with mud and grass that dried hard as mortar. The roof still leaked in places, but they had patched the worst spots with scavenged tin. Inside, the space was dark but warm. The stove's heat no longer fled through 100 cracks, but gathered and held. They had built a second bunk and stuffed mattresses with dried grass. They had rendered tallow and made candles. They had even built a crude chimney extension from stacked stones. It was not beautiful, but it was tight and warm, and it was theirs. Then the blizzard came. It arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-March, when the sky turned the color of old iron and the wind shifted to come straight from the north. Catherine was outside cutting more sod when she saw the wall of white advancing across the plain. "Eliza," she called. Her sister came to the door and looked. They both knew what it was. They had perhaps an hour. They brought in all the wood they had cut, stacking it along the inside wall until there was barely room to move. They filled every container they had with snow to melt for water. They checked the stove, the door, the window seals. Then they went inside and barred the door and waited. The storm hit like a fist. The wind screamed around the curved roof, and snow drove horizontal across the land. The temperature plunged. Even inside their insulated walls, they could feel the cold gathering. They kept the fire burning hot, feeding it constantly, and the little stove glowed red. The storm lasted 3 days. On the first day, they could still see faint light through the windows. On the second day, the snow had drifted up over the windows, and the structure was buried in silence. They lived by candlelight, rationing their wood, eating sparingly. On the third day, the wind finally died. Catherine pushed against the door, but it would not budge. Snow had drifted against it. She looked at Eliza. "We will have to dig out." They used the shovel in their hands, tunneling through the packed snow. When they finally broke through, they emerged into a transformed world. The plains were white and smooth. The drifts rose in great waves, and in the distance, toward town, Catherine saw something that made her heart seize. Smoke. Not the thin gray smoke of a stove, but thick black smoke. Something was burning. Eliza saw it too. The town. They looked at each other for one long moment. Then, without speaking, they began to prepare. They wrapped themselves in every warm layer they had. They filled a sack with what food they could spare. Catherine took the shovel. Eliza took the rope they had used for the sled. They began to walk toward the smoke. The snow was waist deep in places, and the walking was brutal. They broke trail in turns, one leading while the other followed in her tracks, switching when the leader's strength gave out. The distance that had taken them hours in clear weather took them the whole morning through the drifts. As they drew closer, they could see that it was not the town burning, but something on the outskirts. The smoke was coming from the direction of the church. When they finally reached the edge of town, they found chaos. The blizzard had collapsed the roof of the church, and the stove had tipped, setting the interior ablaze. Half the town was there fighting the fire with snow, but it was too late. The building was gone. But that was not the worst of it. The church had served as the emergency shelter. When the storm had hit, a dozen families from outlying homesteads had taken refuge there. Now those families, perhaps 40 people, stood in the snow with nowhere to go. The boarding house was full. Private homes had taken in as many as they could, but there were still families outside, huddled together, with no shelter and night coming on. Catherine and Eliza reached the crowd. People turned to look at them, these two girls who had walked out of the storm. Mrs. Talbot was there, her face streaked with soot. The hotel keeper. Mr. Brennan, the constable. Catherine raised her voice. "Our place, the old Fletcher claim. It is warm. It is tight. We have room. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then someone laughed, a bitter sound. "That wreck? You expect us to shelter in that?" The hotel keeper shook his head. "It is 5 miles out. We would lose people trying to reach it." Catherine looked at Eliza. Her sister's face was calm. Catherine turned back. "We walked here this morning. The drifts are hard enough to bear weight. If we go now, while there is light, we can make it." She looked directly at Mrs. Talbot. "You told me we would not last the winter in that place. We have lasted. It is warm and dry. There is room for 20 if people do not mind close quarters. You are welcome to it." The silence stretched. Then the constable, Harwick, stepped forward. He looked at Catherine and Eliza for a long moment. "I will vouch for them. If they say it is fit, it is fit. I will help lead people out." That broke the spell. Families began to gather their children, their bundles. Mr. Brennan found a wagon and a team of draft horses that could break trail through the drifts. They loaded it with the youngest children and the elderly, with blankets and what food could be spared. Catherine and Eliza led the way on foot, with the constable and a dozen men following. Behind them came the families, a ragged column threading through the white landscape. The journey took until dusk. Twice the wagon became stuck and had to be dug out. 3 times they had to stop to rest the horses. But Catherine and Eliza kept moving, and the column followed. When they finally crested the last rise and saw the structure sitting alone on the plain, several people stopped and stared. It did not look like the wreck they remembered. The sod walls rose solid and thick, and smoke curled from the stone chimney. Light glowed faintly through the windows. It looked like what it was, a shelter built to endure. Catherine opened the door and led them inside. The warmth that greeted them was like a physical embrace. People crowded in, filling every inch of space, and still the warmth held. Eliza fed the stove, and Catherine directed people where to sit, where to lay out their blankets. The families who had scorned them, who had pitied them, who had assumed they would fail, now sat in the home they had built with their own hands. No one spoke much that first hour. They were too tired, too grateful. But as the night deepened, and the children slept, and the adults sat shoulder to shoulder in the flickering light, Mrs. Talbot finally broke the silence. She looked at Catherine and Eliza, and her voice was quiet. "We were wrong about you." Catherine met her eyes. Eliza sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "You were not wrong. You saw 2 girls who had never built anything. You were right to doubt." Mrs. Talbot shook her head. "But you did it anyway." Eliza spoke then, her voice soft but clear. "We did not do it to prove anything. We did it because we had to. And now you are here because you have to be. That is how it works." The constable, Harwick, smiled faintly. "You sound like your father." He was a practical man. Catherine felt something tighten in her chest. She had not spoken of her father since the fever. He would have approved of this. Harwick nodded. He would have. The family stayed for 3 days while the men from town dug out the boarding house and made repairs to damaged homes. During those days, Catherine and Eliza fed them from their stores, managed the stove, kept the warmth steady. The children played in the small space, and the women helped cook, and the men took turns hauling wood. It was crowded and warm. When the families finally left, trekking back to town under clear skies, they left behind gifts: sacks of flour and cornmeal, a ham, a bolt of fabric, a set of good iron cooking pots. Mrs. Talbot left a quilt she had sewn herself. The hotel keeper left candles and bacon. Mr. Brennan left a keg of nails and a note that said, "For your next project." When the last wagon had disappeared over the rise, Catherine and Eliza stood together in the doorway of their home. The sun was setting, turning the snow to gold and rose. The wind had died to a whisper. The winter was not over, but its back was broken. Eliza looked at her sister. "Do you think we will stay here? After the thaw?" Catherine considered. "The town will have work now. We could go back." Eliza nodded slowly. "We could." They stood in silence, watching the light fade. Then Catherine spoke again. "But I think we will stay." Eliza smiled, a small, quiet smile. "I think so too." The structure stood behind them, squat and strange and solid. It was not a house in any traditional sense. It was a hybrid thing, part soddy, part shanty, part ingenuity, but it was warm and it was tight, and it was theirs, built by their own hands from earth and wood and will. In the spring, they would improve it further. They would dig a well. They would build a small barn for chickens. They would plant a garden in the soil that would thaw. The land would provide, as it always had, for those willing to work for it. But that was spring. For now, as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Catherine and Eliza went back inside and closed the door against the cold. The fire in the stove burned steady and warm. They had built something from nothing, and in doing so, they had built themselves. The plains would remember them, two girls who had refused to break, who had turned scorn into shelter, who had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered, the warmth they had shared when the world had turned cold.